When we think about communication, we tend to think of literal language, what someone says or writes to communicate a concept to you. Like, when I tell people I have a BA in communications, they tend to think that that means that I just spent a few years learning how to get good at pretty straightforwardly communicating with words in an alphabetic language like English. And while that's definitely part of communication, it's absolutely not the whole story. Communication encompasses everything about how we send a message from one person to another. Not just with words themselves, but with things like body language, medium, context, and emotionality when we say those words. It includes the ways that technology's impact on communication has changed how we see the world, how different media allows for an entirely different message, and how fundamental communication is to the human experience. However, one thing that tends to get overlooked by comms casuals is the role of symbolism in communication. Video games in particular rely on symbolism a lot to communicate efficiently, like in Baldur's Gate 3, which condenses a lot of information about actions, spells, attacks, and inventory items into these tiny little squares so that all that complex information can be easily accessed on the fly. Overwatch, similarly, relies heavily on symbolism to communicate a lot of very complicated information very quickly to the player, but that's not to say it's easy. Communication through symbolism is a complicated process for a whole lot of reasons, and in this video I want to talk about how and why Overwatch uses symbolism so heavily in communicating with its players. Also, the new channel members poll started up today between these 5 topics. Be sure to stick around until the end of the video to learn more about them. Part 1. What is symbolism? Symbolism, to put it very simply, is when we use a symbol to communicate a more complicated, nuanced concept than what it literally represents. While we're talking about it today in the context of media analysis, which, yes, that is what this technically is, it's not limited to media. When you're driving, you're constantly communicating through non-literal symbols to other drivers. A yield sign, for example, is symbolism. The sign does not say you must yield to oncoming traffic at this intersection, it's a red and white triangle. A stop sign will use the word stop to very clearly indicate you need to stop here, but when you see the word stop inside of a red hexagon with white text and a white border, you also know that that means I am expected to come to a full stop for 3 seconds and then check to see if I have the right of way based on rules that I'm already expected to know, and then I can go. If I see that the car in front of me has a blinking yellow light on the left side of the vehicle, it's telling me that it's planning to turn left. A lot of these are deliberately designed because we needed a standardized way to communicate on the road, but people have also routinely invented their own ways of communicating like this. For example, if someone makes room for you to merge into their lane, you might use your rear wiper to wave back to them and say thank you. A lot of it is also pretty contextual. If somebody flashes their brights at you on the highway, they might be communicating 1, that your brights are on and that you need to turn them off so they can see, 2, that your base headlights are too bright and that you're an asshole for having them, or 3, that there's a speed trap up ahead that's hidden from sight. If your brights are on, it probably means the first one. If they're off but you have those stupid LED headlights, it's probably the second one, and incidentally you deserve it. If neither of those are true though, they're probably trying to warn you about a cop up ahead. And this is a big part of why symbolism can be really interesting to examine. The same symbol can mean very different things in very different contexts. Flashing your brights at someone might be the equivalent of telling someone, hey, you forgot to turn off your brights. But it also might be giving someone the middle finger. Or it might be someone trying to do you a solid, and the symbol derives its meaning from its context. When it comes to Overwatch, symbolism takes a few forms, with the most obvious being the icons used to communicate abilities. These little squares in the bottom right are used to indicate what abilities you have, whether or not they're available for use, and how long you'll have to wait to use them again. If it can be used, it'll be white. If it's on cooldown, it'll be grayed out with a colored meter slowly filling up alongside a countdown. If you've been CC'd, hacked, or otherwise locked out of using your abilities, it'll show a red circle with a line through it to indicate that it's not currently going to be able to be used. The game will also use these same icons in the kill feed where appropriate to indicate how someone died, which allows you to communicate very clearly without needing to do any of it explicitly, and allows a smart player to extrapolate a lot of information about cooldowns, the ult economy, and how winnable a fight is. It's important to mention that symbolism doesn't just apply to anything that's non-literally communicated. Ultimate voice lines, for example, often aren't literally telling you I am using my Valkyrie ultimate, especially when it's on the enemy team, even though that's what they're trying to communicate. Melee attacks in Overwatch aren't literally representing where the person's fist or melee attack is going, especially when it's someone like Zarya, whose melee is different in first versus third person. That's non-literal communication in the sense that what it's literally communicating is a melee attack is happening, even if it's different depending on who's seeing it, but it isn't symbolism. Symbolism is specifically the use of a symbol to communicate something that goes beyond what it literally represents. If you want to say someone looks hot in a picture, you might use your words, or you might send them a fire emoji, or like a red sweating face emoji. Maybe there isn't a specific emoji that communicates the message that you're trying to send, so you might make your own. This is what a lot of Twitch streamers, myself included, do. I have this cute little dancing guy that I use to communicate when I'm celebrating or partying or having fun. I have this Uno reverse card if I want to say no you, and I have this little finger tapping one to communicate that I'm a bottom. In short, symbolism is the use of symbols to communicate a complex message. Using symbols and icons helps condense a lot of information into a much smaller space, which is essential for a game like Overwatch with complex abilities. Way back in the day, I made a video about the information vacuums in Overwatch and made this little graphic to show a more robust description of how Moira's abilities actually work. And while it'd be nice if Overwatch provided that information somewhere in game so you knew what these symbols actually meant, it's still a good indication of how much data each of them is trying to communicate without having to constantly fill your screen with text. However, symbolism isn't easy, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Part 2. Why this is hard. Earlier, I had made an offhand reference to alphabet-based languages, and I want to come back to that quickly. Or not so quickly, I don't know. You know what you're getting into on this channel. There are very broadly two types of written languages out there that can be divided into character-based and alphabet-based languages. Straight-up alphabetic languages are written languages where the symbols represent individual sounds that you string together to form words, with the general premise being that you only need to learn a relatively small number of characters to be able to start putting the language together. A major advantage is that one alphabet can be used for multiple languages because the letters don't represent unique concepts in a specific language, only a unique sound. English, French, and Spanish all use the same alphabet for the most part, but even languages that don't use that alphabet by default can be written using it. Japanese doesn't use the Latin alphabet, but you can write Japanese words with it just using the letters that will replicate the sounds as closely as possible, a practice known as romanization, or romaji. However, a disadvantage is that there is a lot of nuance involved in how we combine our letters, and alphabetic languages tend to evolve pretty rapidly, which can have impacts on trying to preserve knowledge over time. Think of what it's like trying to read Shakespeare, or even trying to read a newspaper from a century or two ago. The words they use, how they spell them, the grammar, a lot of it changes a lot more rapidly than you might think. As well, it's not like everyone just uses the same alphabet. Korean also has an alphabet, but it's obviously not the Latin one. There are also Abjad languages where only consonants are guaranteed to get a written form, and Abugida, where vowels and consonants are paired up into singular letters. A challenge of all these languages is that while it makes sense in theory to form a written language out of sounds rather than whole concepts, that also implies that you agree on what the sounds are, and that is harder than you might think. Some languages, like Spanish, generally maintain a lot of consistency in terms of a word being pronounced the way it's written. Others, like French, can be an absolute clusterfuck if you're not familiar with the nuances of which letters are or aren't being pronounced. Regional accents can also influence this, because the way an Australian, a Brit, a Canadian, and a South African will say an English word will all be pretty different. Like, the letter R should, in theory, have roughly the same sound across every language that uses it, but in reality, it doesn't even necessarily make the sound from word to word within its own language, like in French. Character-based written languages, by contrast, include languages like Japanese or Mandarin Chinese. To be clear, the term character-based is kind of a misnomer. All languages are character-based, at least in theory, but I hope that we can all understand what we're trying to talk about here. We're simplifying the language. Japanese is a syllabic language specifically, which means that characters represent specific syllables. And you might think that that sounds a bit like an abugida, again, the one where consonants and vowels are paired together, but an important distinction is that letters in an abugida will usually use shared visual components to represent shared sound components across multiple letters, while a syllabary won't necessarily use the same symbols to represent the same sound. Chinese is logographic and uses symbols to represent whole words or concepts rather than individual sounds or syllables. The challenge of these kinds of languages is that they obviously aren't as plug-and-play as an alphabetic language. Unlike English, where the challenge is learning the complicated ways that a relatively small number of symbols are deployed, Mandarin Chinese requires you to learn a lot more symbols to actually communicate. However, there's also a pretty massive advantage. Namely, being able to communicate a complex concept with a single symbol is pretty efficient, and this was especially important back before computers. Now, obviously there are exceptions. Lots of letters in English have individual symbolic meaning, like A, B, C, D, and F being used to communicate your grades, or how F also means a sarcastic way of paying your respects. Similarly, certain Chinese characters have sound-based elements as part of an overall character. Importantly, both of these are symbolism still. A letter representing a specific sound is a symbol, just like how a character representing a concept is a symbol. In modern times, a new challenge has also been presented for character-based languages. Namely, an alphabet-based language is a lot easier to fit on a keyboard compared to the thousands of characters that exist in Japanese or Mandarin Chinese. If this sounds kind of hard to grasp, the easiest way I can explain the distinction to you is that it's like the difference between trying to get an answer out of a Ouija board versus trying to get an answer out of the alethiometer from the golden compass. A Ouija board uses the actual letters to spell out words to communicate a message, while the alethiometer uses a combination of 3 symbols to answer a question in a way that the user has to actively learn how to interpret. Ouija board is easier to use, but takes longer to communicate a message and can't evoke more complicated concepts without spelling them out, while the alethiometer is harder to use but is capable of much more complex, dynamic, context-based communication, if you know how to interpret it. Both are communicating through symbols, but in very different ways. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, when you're trying to use symbols to communicate in a game like Overwatch, you're not operating in a bubble. You are developing symbols that exist within the context of all communication that your current target audience uses, and that can be challenging when your target audience is a global audience. Lifeweaver's a good example of this, and possibly the best example of this, because he's one of the most visually obvious users of symbolism. His petal platform is shaped like a lotus flower and will float upwards like a lotus flower on water if you step on it. His thorn volley and healing blossoms are, respectively, using the imagery of both the harmful and healing elements of a flower to indicate whether he's harming or helping people. His ultimate, the Tree of Life, is symbolic to an extent that I hopefully don't really need to explain it to you. Like, it's literally the Tree of Life. Even if you knew nothing about Overwatch, the way that symbols are being used in his kit, both in the UI and the actual in-game components, communicate a lot to the audience about what each of these things is meant to do and represent. Lifeweaver's a unique one, though. The real challenge comes when abilities don't really have an obvious symbol for them, or where the obvious choice for a symbol might get confused with another ability. Tracer is a good example of this. Blink and Recall are both represented by arrows, but in different ways. Blink uses 3 stacked chevrons to indicate the 3 charges, and also that each blink is a small movement. Recall uses a jagged arrow that goes diagonally from the top right to the bottom left to indicate a reversal of movement. Even though these don't literally reflect the way these abilities look in-game, they do a good job of representing both the abilities in isolation and in contrast to one another in other similar movement-based abilities. However, it might be worth asking why a more obvious symbol wasn't used for Tracer's Recall. Like, why not use a clock with an arrow pointing counterclockwise around it to indicate reversing time? Well, that might be too much detail to try and include in such a small symbol, and clarity might get lost. You might say, okay, let's just scrap the clock and keep the arrow. But then you just have an arrow pointing in a circle, and that might indicate a spin or some sort of circular movement, so that might not be the best either. But what if we simplify it further? Like, why don't we just have a symbol of one arrow pointing to the left for Recall instead of a jagged arrow? Well, for one, Soldier already has an arrow pointing to the right to indicate Sprint, and having a similar arrow pointing to the left might indicate that the abilities are similar in some way when they just aren't. An arrow pointing right indicates sprinting in the context of Overwatch, so an arrow to the left might indicate also sprinting? Sprinting backwards? For another, does pointing to the left always indicate going backwards? We read English left to right, top to bottom, so an arrow pointing to the left indicates moving backwards to an English speaker, while an arrow pointing to the right indicates moving forward. But if you speak and read Arabic, you read right to left, top to bottom, so an arrow pointing left indicates forward movement. There's actually a lot of challenges with this in designing UIs for things like websites and web browsers that are meant to be used in different countries, because how you read indicates where you'll start looking for information and where your eye is drawn on a website. If you start in the top left, it makes sense to have information like the name of the website, the logo, the back, the forward, the refresh, the home buttons, all that stuff up there, and leave the more niche utilities to the top right. But for someone who reads the opposite way, it would make sense to similarly reverse the layout. The back button in your web browser points to the left because it's indicating turning back to the previous page. And if you speak English, turning the page to the left indicates the previous page. But again, if you speak Arabic, turning the page to the left indicates the next page. This obviously is not how everything is done, and a lot of the internet, because it's generally globally accessible, is standardized based on Western norms, including linguistic norms like formatting things to be read left to right. However, when it comes to Overwatch, you want someone to be able to recognize that pressing E as Tracer is not simply a movement ability, but something more complicated. So, you use a jagged arrow. But then we might be asking, why does Soldier's sprint point to the right? Why not point forward, given that he's going to be sprinting forwards? Well, then we have to ask, are you pointing forward or pointing up? In a small 2D symbol that's meant to be immediately readable, it can be hard to distinguish between up and forward if the arrow is just pointing in the up direction, and you don't want a player to think that the up arrow indicates some sort of vertical mobility like Baptiste's jump or Pharah's jump jets. Tracer's chevrons get around this by having perspectives kind of enforced in them by having them get smaller as they go up, indicating that they're pointing forward. But having a single arrow makes that harder, and using multiple arrows then just means you're going to get confused with Tracer all over again. You need to be able to specifically communicate horizontal movement, so pointing to the left or right is going to be more useful here, and since you're just indicating movement, you can use more horizontal lines to indicate speed. Pointing to the left or right for sprint is going to be kind of arbitrary, like you can pick either, but once you've established that pointing to the right indicates sprint, that means that that has to be part of your language going forward. You have to keep it in mind as you design more symbols. And remember, you've got to do this hundreds of times, once for each one of each hero's distinctive abilities within the UI, as well as occasionally knock-on effects in that same UI. For example, you might try to be super literal with it. Ana's bio nade is just the nade in the symbol. And if you're hit with the anti-heal, the symbol you'll see is a cross with a slash to it to indicate that healing, represented by that cross, is being blocked. Then again, calling that super literal is being a bit misleading. A cross isn't a literal symbol for healing, nor is it one that, stretches back through eternity. Its use as a symbol for healing comes from the Red Cross, which was established in the Geneva Convention in 1864. But we can't use a red cross because, in case you've missed the many joke articles about video games committing war crimes, it is in fact a contravention of the Geneva Convention to use the Red Cross for anything other than the actual operations of the Red Cross. However, not only is a cross not a literal symbol, it's also not a universal one for this specific purpose. The Red Cross is complemented by the Red Crescent, which is more typically used in Muslim countries and has been in use for well over a century at this point. Israel also began using a Red Star of David, arguing that the cross and crescent moon were Christian and Islamic symbols respectively, and that a Jewish symbol should be recognized as well. Within Israel, the Red Star of David is still used, but outside of Israel, there's a third symbol used instead, called the Red Crystal, that's meant to be neutral. It's not connected to any religious imagery, it's not connected to any sort of specific region or specific identity, it's just a symbol. In theory, this is the symbol you'd want to use for the purposes of the Red Cross, but in practice, we, meaning those of us in the countries where Overwatch is being produced and developed, exclusively recognize the cross as the basic symbol of health. So using either the crescent moon, the Star of David, or the crystal wouldn't be clear communication, even though a character like Ana comes from a country where you can make the argument that the crescent moon would be the more appropriate symbol for healing. Overwatch uses the cross to represent healing, but we can't use red because that's a war crime, so we use white for the UI and yellow for in-game effects instead. Then, to represent anti-healing, we use a cross that's been crossed out because it's canceling out the healing, and we use the color purple because purple is the opposite of yellow. Alternatively, you might go for something that is entirely non-literal. Think Sombra's EMP, which is represented by her logo of a digitized sugar skull that's also used to indicate a hacked status effect. On the surface, this is a very stupid symbol for an EMP. Dia de los Muertos has nothing to do with an EMP, sugar skulls in general don't, they don't have anything to do with hacking in general either. But it works as an Overwatch specific symbol because of context. Sombra is the only hero who can hack someone and she's defined by that ability. So the Sombra specific status effect and ability can be represented with a Sombra specific symbol. Anti-heal symbols, by contrast, aren't directly associated with Ana in any way, which frees them up to be used by Junker Queen or anyone else. But since hacking is directly associated with Sombra, she is the only one who can use that ability going forward. Otherwise, it would just create even more confusion. Overwatch's symbolism is challenging because it can't just use a literal language without locking out anyone who doesn't understand that language, and it also has to be able to efficiently use space. So it has to functionally invent its own character-based language where each character must represent a distinct mechanic that can be easily understood, clearly read, and not confused with anything else that exists in the game or anything in the real world that players might already be familiar with. After all of that though, you might think, why even bother with symbolism if it's this complicated to do? And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the video. Part 3. Why it's good to do. Symbolism isn't just being used arbitrarily in video games or otherwise. The reason we standardize the stop sign is because it means that your ability to travel safely, either by car, by transit, or by foot, is standardized regardless of literacy in a particular language. If I travel to Quebec, I might not be able to speak the language, but I can still drive safely on Montreal streets because the symbols are shared. The reason we have the red cross, red crescent, and red crystal isn't just that it seemed cool, it's that we needed a way to collectively recognize the aid workers in zones of conflict, tragedy, or disaster in order to protect them, and how to communicate that very clearly and consistently. There's a reason why the Red Cross have a massive stick up their asses about video games using their symbol. They do not want it diminished at all, and do not want it implemented in a context where its meaning might get distorted. After all, let's say you gave Mercy a red cross on her back, and then told players in all those little tip tools, hey, remember you need to kill Mercy because killing the healers makes it easier to kill the rest of the enemy team. That would be sending an incredibly fucked up message that would be directly at odds with the reason why the red cross exists as a symbol. And even though you might not consciously interpret it that way, it would affect how you perceive it subconsciously. Symbolism allows us to not only cross language barriers, but also communicate gravity, importance, and seriousness in a way that we can't always do as easily with written languages. The word medic isn't immediately recognizable, and it also doesn't communicate the very specific context of this medic is protected by the Geneva Conventions as part of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, Red Crystal organization, and doing violence to them or impersonating them to do violence is a war crime. Another major advantage of symbolism is that it can be much better at preserving knowledge. Chinese is an obvious example that's been used by video essayists like Abigail Thorne to point out how old Chinese text can be uncovered and interpreted much more easily than old Greek, Latin, or English text because the meaning of the characters is much more straightforwardly maintained than the meaning of words in an alphabet. A really good example of the value of being able to create symbols that can persevere through time is the work that went into creating the symbol for radioactivity, which is the wheel with the 6 spokes, 3 colored in, 3 not colored in. That symbol was created because we needed a way to communicate that something was going to be radioactive that couldn't be confused with anything else and did not rely on written words. Because radioactive material, as you may know, can remain dangerous for a long-ass time, and anyone who maybe, say, buried it in the middle of the desert isn't going to be around for the thousands of years that it might still be dangerous. So we need to have a symbol that can communicate that. However, it's not just about the symbol, we do also have to, at least to some extent, try and maintain records of what those symbols mean. Otherwise, a big radiation symbol might be a warning, or it might be seen by some future civilization as indication that buried treasures are here, which not what you want to communicate with the radioactive symbol. In Canada, there's been a long struggle by Indigenous peoples to have their sovereignty and self-governance returned to them, and a big part of that has included having to demonstrate to the Canadian government that they had laws, societies, and constitutions like any other nation. That something, namely their governance and laws, had been taken from them and needed to be returned, as opposed to the understanding under colonialism that the Indigenous peoples had none of those things that could be taken in the first place, so they needed to be given civilization. For example, back in 2013, the grandmothers of Kitigan Zibi Anishinabeg presented the Pikehead Constitution to the National Judicial Institute to demonstrate that fact. See, the pike was a pretty important animal for the Anishinaabe, so it makes sense to use it as a way to communicate through symbolism. The bones of the pike's skull were disassembled and used to represent different laws in their constitution. Anishinabekwe, or woman, represents a woman and the 2 medicine bags that she carries, one for the family, one for the community. A man, by contrast, carries only 1 bag. For another example, Memengwe literally translates to butterfly because the bone is shaped like a butterfly. However, it represents more specifically the rights and freedoms of the Anishinaabe people to live and move on the land. Milopemetesawin is an interesting one because the term represents a bit of a unique concept that English doesn't really have a good direct translation for. One translation for it is life principles / hygiene, which seem kinda unrelated until you consider another translation in combination, responsibility. Once you learn that it's represented by a bone shaped like a little axe and is meant to symbolize taking care of yourself and others the way you have a responsibility to keep your axe sharpened for yourself and so you can do the work your community needs to do, you start to realize how it reflects a different version of ethics than we might conceptualize in English. And because English doesn't really have a direct translation for this in terms of a single word that could be added to a constitution, our constitutions don't have that provision in them. Ethical behavior and responsibility as codified in this constitution is an understanding that you need to take care of both yourself and others, and that your responsibility to your community under this constitution does inherently reflect caring for yourself in terms of the body and gift you were given by your creator, things like eating, sleeping, clothing, housing, etc., as well as caring for others under the same umbrella. Again, remember, English doesn't have a word for this in the same way, so what the Kitagan-Zibi grandmothers were doing is demonstrating that there was a unique judicial, legal, ethical system that was being developed by the Anishinaabe people that they had before colonialism, and thus were able to prove their point. Something I want to note is the interesting intentionality behind this. For the Anishinaabe people, specifically the grandmothers of Kitagan-Zibi who coalesced these teachings and meanings to explain them to the Canadian government, the goal was explicitly to demonstrate that the Anishinaabe people were not only not lawless, but specifically had their own constitution. The Anishinaabe story behind it is that the creator deliberately hid their constitution in the skull of a pike, a fish that they have a close relationship with, so they would regularly be reminded of and given access to their laws. Every time you see the pike's head, you're reminded of your rights and freedoms. And frankly, if we're being honest, this reliance on symbolism allowed the Anishinaabe to be way more familiar with their constitution than most people in Canada or the United States, because it would be actively encountered in their daily lives. The laws were not written, but still preserved, both through oral storytelling and the physical symbols that connect to real-world concepts. Forcing them into English or any other language inherently results in a loss of meaning because the concepts aren't English. Those meanings and stories, even throughout colonialism and reservations and the ongoing fight to protect, preserve, and restore Aboriginal rights, title, and culture, have been passed on from generation to generation through oral storytelling and tradition until they could eventually be reconnected with their land, their laws, and their pike. This constitution would be something that a parent or elder would explain to a child as they were being taught how to fish, and would stick with you every time you harvested a pike. Not only serving as a reminder of your laws, but also your reliance on the environment and the gift that you were given by your creator, who left your constitution in the head of a pike, so you could always go back and get it when you needed it. Symbolism serves a really important purpose in communication because it doesn't just allow us to literally communicate, but to communicate more deeply than would be possible without ascribing those additional meanings to these symbols. Symbolism is everywhere in our lives, from the cars we drive, to the cleaning chemicals we might use at work or at home, to the games we play, and so much more. It allows us to communicate not just with language, but beyond language. To use arrows to indicate everything from sprinting to time travel to teleportation, depending on context, clues, and additional symbols. In the context of Overwatch, develop a whole new logographic alphabet to communicate hundreds of distinct actions and outcomes so that you don't need to try and find a way to condense the words, Farah used Barrage to kill Ana, but Ana still managed to hit her with sleep darts so she fell to her death in a pit, resulting in both players dying and Farah burning her ult into the kill feed. Overwatch uses symbolism to communicate a massive amount of information effectively and efficiently, and while it certainly doesn't do it flawlessly, it should not continue to go unnoticed how video games as a medium are genuinely revolutionizing how we use symbolism to communicate in media, how we are developing complex understandings of live service language models in action. The other reason this is important to understand is because it reflects the need to change how we view the process of learning a video game. Video games rely so heavily on symbolism and these new distinct boutique logographic languages that we should start recognizing the process of learning to play a new game is a lot more like learning a new language than anything else. When you learn how to play a new sport, you learn new mechanics and skills, but you are still fundamentally relying on existing concepts with an existing language. When you learn a new video game, you're learning brand new concepts that are being communicated through a brand new written language. And I would argue that failing to recognize this important distinction is part of why learning a new game can be so fucking frustrating. For myself personally, I'd kind of like to try and play League, but I have no idea what any of those symbols mean. And if you're trying to play Overwatch without ever having the symbols explained to you, it's like being dropped in the line of a fast food restaurant in a foreign country during rush hour and being expected to order your food quickly and correctly. Otherwise, everyone just starts getting visibly frustrated with you or outright yelling. To be clear, the symbolism of Overwatch is good. That's not the problem or a problem, and in fact, I think it's genuinely something to admire the devs for being able to do pretty well. The problem is that if we want to make games more accessible to people, particularly if we want to be able to bring in new players for existing live service games as they get increasingly complicated, we need to recognize the importance of giving people that English to Overwatch dictionary so they can actually use it to understand what's happening. Otherwise, the language of Overwatch becomes both a major advantage to the game for the people who are already fluent in it, and a major hindrance to anyone who's trying to get into it. And that goes for every other live service game where the language's size and complexity just keeps creeping higher and higher. Just like with any other type of communication, teaching people how to do it is one of the most important parts of making it actually useful, and I think gaming will keep seeing this cycle of live service games becoming more and more inaccessible over time until something is done to actively work to help people understand what it means when someone dies of square with a bunch of smaller squares, or 3 diagonal lines. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to stop by twitch.tv/thevivaros if you want to see me playing some more Overwatch. Also, like I mentioned at the top, the next Members' Choice poll launched yesterday, so for $5 a month, you can join the membership to vote for which of these 5 videos will be coming out later this month. First up is Elo Hell or Why We Cope, a returning topic from September and November about what Elo Hell is, why it's a cope, and why we cope to begin with. Next is how video games distort people's perceptions of real-world resources, a returning topic from December focused on how resource extraction games like Minecraft influence how we perceive real-world resources. Then we have Just Say Magic Exists in Overwatch, the runner-up from January focused on why, or if, Overwatch just starts saying magic exists. Then there's our first new topic, the toxic sword of Damocles in ranked Overwatch, which would be about why the ever-present threat of toxicity in Overwatch, even if it doesn't manifest in every game, is such a problem for it. And finally, we have our final new topic. What is Overwatch supposed to be? Which will try and answer the question of what Overwatch is supposed to be as a game and what it would have to do to achieve that. Channel memberships are $5 a month and can be purchased through the join button below this video, and your support really does help a lot with being able to keep doing this. Special thank you to all my channel members: MiniQ, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Connor, Yoshi of the Wire, It's Peggy BTW, CatLover192, Sourdough, Illuma Riley, Venus, Monkey12 Ninja, Cadence, Windex the Great, The Leathers, and Marsh Alice. Whether you're a member, a subscriber, or just checked out a video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.